This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, welcoming you to episode 392 of the FCPA Compliance Report. Today I have back with me Jonathan Marks. Jonathan and Scott Fleming and Richard Riley recently authored a paper in the ACFE Fraud magazine entitled Meta Model of Fraud, Two Combined Triangles for Better Fraud Case Comprehension. In this special live recording, Jonathan talks to us about the meta model of fraud and how you can use this to help develop a more effective set of controls for your anti-corruption compliance program. It's a fascinating exploration of the not intersection of fraud and corruption, but how really corruption is a subset of fraud, and if you use the principles of fraud detection, prevention, and remediation in your anti-corruption program, it will make it much stronger. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Alec DeLeon. You're listening to the FCPA Compliance Report live from Moderno Tacos Tex-Mex in Houston, Texas.
So we are live, and you are privileged today to have Jonathan Marks. Jonathan is a well-known compliance practitioner, CPA, internal audit, and all-around good guy. And we are live today to talk about his most recent article, Meta Model of Fraud. It's in this most recent issue of the ACFE magazine. And in this, Jonathan uses the fraud triangle as a starting point to explain why, although the model certainly was innovative in the 1950s, it really needs to be rethought and perhaps updated, and he and some of his colleagues have been doing significant research over the past 18 or 24 months on that. So Jonathan, first of all, welcome to Moderno. I hope you enjoyed your breakfast taco, and thank you.
I did, Tom, and it's great being here.
So tell us about the article, really just kind of walk us through. I guess maybe I should start with, why did you guys feel the need to look at the information and data that you did to come up with the article?
So there was a couple significant happenings in the professional world. There were a few cases that we saw that had some things in them that were sort of concerning to us as professionals, and so we took a deeper dive. And one of them was Travis versus State Farm Fire and Insurance Casualty. The other was Kremski versus Kremski, which is the one that originally poked our interest, and then Hupp versus Heaps. These three cases talk about the fraud examiner getting into the mind of the alleged fraudster. And once we started to realize that the courts were not keen on fraud examiners who are not licensed psychologists or sociologists or had any advanced degree in mental health or mental behavior, we realized that there was probably some more digging that we had to do, and it was probably worth taking a look at how we go about fraud fundamentally as well.
So what is the fraud triangle, and why is it a good starting point to help in any analysis of fraud?
Well, to sort of paraphrase what Donald Cressy did back in the 50s, who basically, and by the way, it's sort of a misnomer. Cressy did not really create the fraud triangle. That was really the Stephen Albrecht that came up with the fraud triangle. But what Cressy did was he looked at over 200 cases, and he analyzed those cases, and he looked for the sort of the common elements of what a fraudster might be going through when he or she committed fraud. And back then it was certainly more he than she. Today it's it's almost even. But Cressy came up with three elements, which were pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. And the pressure, obviously, I think that's very self-explanable. Everyone goes through pressures in their life, whether it's financial pressures or other types of pressures. So, sort of the pressure to cross over the ethical line. And, ironically, we've been talking about this a lot this week, but there's a lot of folks out there that are situationally ethical, that if pressed or pressured in the right way, they might cross over that line. And so, Cressy came up with certainly pressure. Opportunity is really the opportunity to commit fraud. Are controls in place? Are they operating effectively? We know controls provide reasonable assurance, but, if the fraudster really figured out how to override those controls or realized that there was a gap in controls, could they just pass right through that and actually commit the fraud? And, rationalization is really an ex post facto, state of mind whereby somebody rationalizing, the fraud, whether they're entitled to it or they think they deserve it or so on and so forth. Those were the three elements that Cressy came up with, and certainly things that we consider today. Fast forward to 2007, 2008 timeframe, where we were taking a look at the Bernie Madoffs of the world and the Boskis and the Milkins and the Kozlowskis. One of the things that I did was I took a look at the fraud triangle and said, hey, it's really not applicable in today's environment since, as I told you, Cressy really looked at sort of, smaller middle market companies. A lot of these bigger frauds had bigger personalities. So, even though we used the fraud triangle in our example for our meta model of fraud, certainly something that really should be looked at a little bit closer, and maybe the fraud pentagon might be considered, which adds two additional elements to the fraud triangle, which are competence and arrogance. And competence is really the person's ability to override internal controls and basically socially control the situation to his or her advantage and sell it to others. As we know, fraudsters build a false sense of integrity around themselves because they want you to trust them. And being able to sell it to someone else, whatever story that might be, and Bernie Madoff, as an example, was a master at selling. And so that's why I think competence is certainly a piece that really should be considered as part of the human factors that we mentioned before. And arrogance is basically an attitude of superiority or greed, where policies and procedures or ethics simply just don't apply to those individuals. Sort of a sense of entitlement. So that's the fraud triangle, so to speak, Tom. And I could certainly talk about the other elements of fraud that we included in our meta model.
So I was actually wanted to move to that, but could you explain, in response to the fraud triangle, companies set up either detect or prevent controls. How did those controls work? And then how does the meta model move past the defensive measures companies put in place to really explain how fraud occurs going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So while the fraud triangle identifies conditions under which fraud may occur, the triangle of fraud action, which I will talk about in a second, actually, let's talk about that right now. The triangle of fraud action, which is the act, the concealment, and the conversion, which are the elements of a fraud, not the sort of the psychological aspects of a fraudster. Describe the activities an individual must perform to perpetrate that particular fraud or to execute on that bad behavior. According to the evolution of fraud theory by Dominique Fleming and Mary Jo Kranecker and Richard Riley, all of which I have high respect for, this really comes into play. And so let's, when we look at the elements of a fraud, the act represents the execution methodology of the fraud. So in other words, the schemes that somebody can actually perpetrate. The concealment is a strategy. So the concealment strategy is how do we hide this? And the conversion would be is how would the individual take what they have, what information they have, whatever they committed, and convert that into some type of gain or benefit to them. So, in the past, when we really focused on, and I think a lot of practitioners focus on the fraud triangle, looking at the fraudster and trying to get into the mind behind the crime, which we told you based on these three cases, and I think there's actually one more, that the courts are not really in favor of, fraud examiners getting into the mind behind people. By taking a look at sort of the act, the concealment strategy, and the conversion piece, combined with those three psychological or human factor elements, or the four elements in the fifth one that I mentioned with regard to the fraud pentagon, really does give us a better way to kind of look at, how fraud might occur, and if it does, sort of the reasons behind that. And then, in the middle, if you look at the meta model that we actually put forth, we talk about sort of the anti-fraud measures and what measures can a corporation actually put in place, to help, deter or detect fraud. In other words, what controls can they put into place, as you mentioned? A lot of times those controls are not properly designed, as we well know. A lot of times those controls are weak. A lot of times those controls don't necessarily meet the objectives of what the organization has set out to do. But, I think, from the question that you asked and from what we're actually putting forth today, it's a different paradigm than what everybody is used to, and I think it's one where regulators need to take a good, strong look at this. I think the AICPA and other professional organizations need to take a good, strong look at this. We talk about SAS 99 and actually considering fraud in an audit. I think if you read some of the stuff that's in there, it's very, very good, but I think depicting it in this way really does send a very, very strong message to the practitioners on how to potentially combat, fraud in today's environment.
So, Jonathan, you've been an anti-fraud examiner for many years now. Obviously, you've seen many different types of schemes. In the FCPA world, we have seen, obviously, also many different types of bribery and corruption schemes. But do you see fraudsters becoming more sophisticated as companies become better at putting in prevent or detect controls? Because in the FCPA world, I see more sophisticated bribery and corruption schemes. Would that be accurate? And does your meta model address that issue?
I think it does. I think the meta model addresses it because, like I said, if we talk about the fraud, we'll call it the fraud triangle. But if you look at, what Cressy came up with, pressure, opportunity, and rationalization, that's really the perpetrators, like I said. And then you look at the actual crime, which is the act, the concealment, and the conversion. I think, the acts, a lot of the acts are pretty much the same, but when you look at how they can try to conceal this, it's very, very, very creative in today's environment because, the more that compliance programs evolve and they become more mature, and the better you have people on the lookout for potential bad behavior within an organization, the more the fraudster in committing these bad acts, whether it be bribery or asset misappropriation or financial statement fraud or a combination of all three, has to be that much more clever. And so, while we try to profile white-collar criminals or fraudsters or people that pay bribes, they're profiling us as well. And so, they need to understand the sort of the landmarks and the minefields of a control environment, and they become much, much more clever and sophisticated in the way they're carrying out some of these frauds. I agree with you. I think, times have changed. It's just not as simple as, taking a bag of cash and walking up to a government official and bribing them. There are other things in play here. There are shell companies. You and I could sit here and talk for hours upon hours of the different fraud schemes, whether it's gift cards, saving up per diem allowances in order to pay off government officials, shell companies, different types of vendors, conflicts of interests, any other type of benefit that you could, generally imagine. They've become more and more and more sophisticated, and that's why I think having this meta model of fraud can really help.
So, Jonathan, in the 2018 ACFE Global Report, one of the things that really struck me was the indicia or red flags of a fraudster were very similar to the red flags or indicia under bribery and corruption. And it's really that psychological component that you've talked about. Is that a message that you find your clients are more willing to hear now, that they need to take a look at those types of factors in the bribery and corruption world as well?
I think so. And I think that's a great point. And so if you look at sort of the elements or the characteristics of a fraudster, and you kind of break them all out, and you look at, where we are today and what we've been trying to put forth as practitioners over the years. If I walked into a internal audit meeting or an audit committee meeting and we started talking about profiling individuals, as part of our risk assessment process, people would look at us and say, well, we really can't do that. I think, people have come full circle now and realize that the human element is really, 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 really critical. And this is something that I've been beating the drum on for literally since, 2004, 2005. And, people looked at me, with crazy eyes, and now all of a sudden they're, I think they're really starting to pay attention. Joe Wells, who was really the founder of the ACFE and the father of the ACFE, said something which resonates in my head till this day. He said, books and records don't commit fraud, people do. And books and records don't commit or pay bribes, people do. And unless you understand that human element and human characteristics, it's very, very difficult to assess risk. I think people are just missing something. So, in our risk assessment and the way we actually carry out our risk assessment and our recipe for risk assessment, we actually take a look at the human element and consider the gatekeepers and what their traits might be, and sort of some of those factors that the ACFE lays out, or the indicia of a fraudster, and those particular characteristics. And there are people that are at higher risk, and people should stand up and pay attention to them, and they should look at the controls surrounding them, and they should put monitoring procedures in place. So, absolutely. I mean, the schemes are generally the same. The way they carry it out are a lot different, like we talked about. They're becoming a lot more clever, and I think the human element is something that's been ignored for way too long. And I'm glad finally now it's being put forth as sort of one of those key factors in assessing risk, and and generally in organizations' plight to deter and detect fraud.
Jonathan, you're here in Houston. You spoke yesterday to the Greater Houston Business and Ethics Roundtable on root cause analysis. And I was wondering, from your perspective as a subject matter expert in performing root cause analysis, is the psychological factors that are identified in the fraud triangle, is that something that can be, if not uncovered, at least investigated through a root cause analysis?
Oh, I think so. I think you take all the data I would literally reach out and hug all the data that we learned from either doing an investigation or some type of inquiry into a matter, and use that to our advantage in uncovering or figuring out what the root cause was of a particular situation. Again, I'm not a licensed psychologist or a medical doctor, but I do know human behavior based on my 30 plus years of experience. And I think looking at, sort of pressure, opportunity, and rationalization along with competence and arrogance, and then taking a look at sort of, if you look at the fraud acts, which are the act, the concealment, and the conversion, which is actually the crime element in our META model. I think that's ultimately important in doing root cause analysis, because in root cause analysis, what we're really trying to do is we're really trying to find the one domino that fell. And, is it, did you hire somebody that really shouldn't have been in that organization? How did they get into that organization? That's something that you really need to consider. And that's not something that you could potentially, initiate countermeasures for. And so, getting to the root cause of things and really considering, pressures, opportunities, and rationalizations when we're looking at root cause, is certainly critical. Take a look at opportunity, for example. Opportunity in the fraud model, from a perpetrator perspective, based on our META model, opportunities, the internal controls are in place. When we're looking at root cause, we are looking, were the controls in place? Were they properly designed? Do they meet the organization's objectives? Are there proper policies and procedures, that sort of augment this? Is there proper monitoring in place? I mean, these are all things that would relate to control. Is it a breakdown in a control? Is it negligence? Is it just pure fraud? Is it management override? I would take a look at every single one of the elements that we lay out in our META model when I'm absolutely doing it, when we're doing a fraud, obviously an investigation, but more importantly, specifically when we're doing root cause analysis as well.
So, Jonathan, one of the things that I think makes you unique in this field is you have the ability to go in and do the day-to-day spade tactical work, but you also work with boards of directors. If you could send a message to boards of directors around the META model of fraud, what would it be?
My message to the board of directors, and specifically the audit committee, is the game is changing and has changed for a while, and you should be challenging your chief compliance officer, your chief legal officer, and your chief audit executive on how they're looking at fraud within your organization. The old tactics and strategies on assessing risk simply don't apply anymore. There are new tactics and strategies for doing a fraud risk assessment and assessing risk, and building that and operationalizing that into the audit plan, operationalizing that into the compliance program. And then certainly, a key component of this is certainly from a legal perspective, your general counsel should be ultimately involved in this exercise as well. So, that's my message. My bigger message is that, if you look at the triangle of the compliance function, the legal function, and the audit function, they all have to be working in harmony. And if they're not working in harmony and sharing information, it's a really tough battle in today's day and age.
So, Jonathan, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I've been visiting with Jonathan Marks on he and Scott Fleming and Richard Riley's article, META Model of Fraud, which appears in the most recent issue of Fraud magazine, the July-August 2018 issue. Jonathan, it's also available on your social media site. Could you give us that site?
Sure, Tom. So my blog site is boardandfraud.com. That's boardandfraud.com. So boardandfraud.com. And, it's up there as well, and you can certainly get it from the ACFE website as well.
So, Jonathan, we'll link to that in the show notes. And thank you for not only coming to Houston, but taking the time to visit with me today.
Always fun, Tom. Thanks for having me.
This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. As I indicated, we'll link to Jonathan's article in the show notes. I hope you've enjoyed this first live podcast from Moderno's Taco Cafe in Houston, Texas. I hope you will join us again next week for another episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.